Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, today we're going to take a look at a video that was recommended to me over on our Discord server. And we're going back to our bread and butter, the American Civil War. This is from the channel Grunge, which I think we've done a reaction or two from them in the past. This one's called Things That Still Don't Make Sense About the American Civil War. My hunch is it's something that probably doesn't make sense to the average casual learner when it comes to the Civil War, but those of us who have taken a little bit deeper dive, maybe less so. But whatever the case may be, it'll be a good opportunity for us to talk a little bit more about some of the more unknown parts of the American Civil War. So that's what we're going to do today. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. And I want to thank Neil McKibben, who is one of our latest supporters on Patreon. Thank you so much for signing up, for your support, for your generosity. Could not do this without you. Let's dive into this one.
When it comes to the American Civil War, we think we know what happened and why, but do we? Even 160 years later, there are things about the conflict that make no sense, at least in retrospect.
So kind of cool, just in observing some of those images, at the beginning what we saw was cornfield, and I think that was a scene from the director's cut of Gods and Generals. They had some stuff they filmed for the Battle of Antietam that never made it into the final movie. And I think that was one of the scenes from that. And then the last one where you see the balloon, that was actually from The Blue and the Gray, where they actually feature Thaddeus Lowe, who was on the Union side during the Peninsula Campaign, who employed a balloon. And then the Confederates used one of their own in The Blue and the Gray. And there's a whole scene with a couple of the main characters going up in the balloon. And I won't spoil it. If you've never seen it, definitely check it out.
When Louisiana joined the Confederacy in early 1861, it brought with it the thriving port of New Orleans, a wealthy and populous city that was, briefly, the largest in the Southern Coalition, for about a second, that is.
Briefly, because it fell so early in the war. But yeah, New Orleans was not only the largest city in the Confederacy, it was by far the largest city in the Confederacy. But we don't hear much about it because it was kind of on the fringe of the action. You know, most of the action has taken place in the Eastern Theater in places like Virginia, and then in what we called the Western Theater in Kentucky, Tennessee, and then eventually Georgia.
Because New Orleans was the first major Southern city to be captured by Union forces, surrendering in April 1862. This was a huge blunder on the part of the Confederacy.
I don't know if I would call it the first major city to fall to Union forces. I think that would probably be Nashville. Nashville falls shortly after the fall of Forts Henry and Donelson, which protected the rivers that go into Tennessee. And once the river fell, they couldn't hold the city of Nashville.
They looked, to put it bluntly, totally incompetent, and not without good reason. They just basically given up one of their side's greatest assets and set the Union up to start clawing back control of the vital Mississippi River from both directions. And on top of that, Union also made away with $800,000 in gold that had been stored in the Dutch consul's office. How had the Confederacy biffed so hard? New Orleans had few defenses around the town itself. They counted on Forts Jackson and St. Philip, two small Mississippi River outposts, to stop any ships trying to move north to the city. And there was a heavy chain that could be stretched across the river to prevent ships from passing.
Yeah, a lot of people who don't really pay much attention to such things maybe kind of assume that New Orleans is right on the ocean and right at the mouth of the Mississippi. It's not. It's actually dozens of miles inland from the mouth of the Mississippi River. You're getting into the delta there, but further downriver toward the ocean, you had these two forts, which were accessible from the ocean by the powerful Union Navy.
Union Navy Captain David Farragut simply broke the chain and sent its boats right through, while gunships fired on the Confederate forts, limiting their ability to respond. Sounds basic, but the strategy worked, and New Orleans fell into Union hands like a freshly fried beignet. It wasn't...
Yeah, so a couple of things about the Navy. I think the Confederates probably, in hindsight, relied a little too heavily on fixed fortifications on the Mississippi River, thinking that would be enough to protect them. And for a while it did. Places like Vicksburg, where it took until the spring of 1863 before General Grant and Flag Officer Foote decided, you know what, we're just going to run the guns. I think it was Foote. He might have been dead by then. Had to double check, didn't want to be wrong. It was Porter. I think Andrew Foote was out of the action by that point in the war. Foote had been the guy who had been working with Grant earlier. But yeah, they run the guns, and the same thing is going to happen over and over again. These fixed fortifications, the Union's just going to blow right past them.
Far from Confederate Virginia, like it was this close, but the North didn't move the U.S. capital from Washington during the war. As for the Confederacy, they originally and wisely made Montgomery, Alabama their capital city. Good move, keeping the center of their government far from Union forces. But then they changed their minds. Once Virginia seceded, the Confederacy moved its capital to Richmond and kept it there until shortly before the end of the war.
It's only 100 miles from Washington, D.C. Seems kind of stupid.
They did have a good reason for the move. The short answer is that Virginia was important.
Yeah.
Richmond was the second largest city in the Confederacy after New Orleans, which means it's the largest city in the Confederacy. It was also relatively industrial, contributing essential factories to the agricultural South's war effort. Then there was the psychological factor. Virginia was heavily associated with the Revolution, so it was somewhat of a catch for the South.
Yeah, Richmond is close to the hometowns of people like General Washington. And it all the things he mentioned are absolutely true. There's also a factor with the South where they really feel like Maryland is pro-Confederacy, which parts of it were, especially the eastern part of Maryland, but the western part not as much. And they felt like that was kind of home territory, and that would put even more pressure on Washington. And so there's a lot of reasons why it gets moved from Montgomery, Alabama, which is where Jefferson Davis was sworn in. It just made a lot of sense because the population center of the Confederacy is in places like Virginia and North Carolina. Those are the two most heavily populated states in the Confederacy.
The people of Virginia would pay a heavy price for the defiant, even sassy placement of the Confederate capital. Northern Virginia was one of the most horrific meat grinders of the war, and by war's end, Richmond was in ruins.
And that was not the fault of the Union Army, though. Richmond was burned by their own people.
The art of war is simple enough.
That's a scene from Grant.
Till the end.
Well, the almost end. Danville, Virginia served as the capital of the Confederacy at the very, very end of the war from about April 3rd to April 10th. The Civil War ended in 1865, so even the youngest veterans would have been lucky to reach the middle of the next century, and yet 90-year-old Irene Triplett died in North Carolina in May 2020, having collected a Civil War pension of $73.13 per month until her very last day. When Triplett was born, her mother Elida Hall was 34, but her father Mose Triplett was 83. Originally in the Confederate Army with the 26th North Carolina Infantry, Mose had conveniently fallen ill before the Battle of Gettysburg.
Yeah, because the 26th North Carolina got slaughtered at Gettysburg. It lost 80%.
And because most of the men in his unit were killed, injured, or captured in the battle. Then, and this was key for Irene's future, Mose switched sides and joined a Union regiment, which entitled him to an Army pension for life.
Now, there were pensions for Confederate soldiers, but they were given by the former Confederate states, even some that were not Confederate states, like Kentucky. My great-great-great-grandfather had a Confederate pension from the state of Kentucky. So that did happen much later.
On both sides. Oh, boy, it was a mess. I mean, a mess.
This may have been what attracted his much younger second wife. The heart wants what the heart wants, and sometimes that's a guaranteed monthly pension payment. As a dependent child of a veteran who had, in the nick of time, served on the winning side, Irene was entitled to government support for life.
It is.
I'm curious about that, and it may have been that there was a change in the law, or there may have been some special circumstances that allowed her to receive that, because typically the pensions for Civil War children only went until they reached, I think, 16, and then they weren't eligible for those anymore.
It's a good story.
So I'm not sure why she had it for life.
Better.
Supposedly, Abraham Lincoln said early in the Civil War, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." But why? Besides the fact that he was born there, what else does it have besides that blue grass? The important part was the state's northern border, most of which was the Ohio River. Confederate interference, or God forbid, control of the waterway would be an enormous roadblock for the Union. If you're having flashbacks to the New Orleans stuff we talked about before, thanks for paying attention.
So think about this. I mean, one of the things you don't think about is when we talk about the South, when we talk about slavery, slave states versus free states, how much of the territory of the United States especially the eastern United States, was slave state territory. I mean, I live in Ohio, and I'm in northeast Ohio. I'm literally an hour drive from Lake Erie. I'm 2.5, 3 hours from Canada. I could, if I could fly to Canada, it's like 60, 70 miles away. I'm only about 35, 40 minutes away from what was Virginia in 1860. That's how far north slavery existed at the beginning of the war. And so, yeah, the Ohio River is the boundary between free state and slave state. Kentucky, Western Virginia, Maryland, Missouri, these states go over to the Confederacy. The Union's got a real problem.
And then there were the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, key invasion routes into the South in the event Kentucky stayed with the Union. At the top of the war, Kentucky declared itself neutral, probably because they were a state of slaveholders that also had important cultural and economic ties to the North.
I'm so conflicted.
A neutral Kentucky unwilling to cooperate with Union war aims was much better for the South than a Union-allied Kentucky. But once again, the South absolutely biffed this opportunity. In April 1861, the Louisville Journal reported a senator from Georgia saying that the border states would have to do all the fighting, which would allow the rest of the South to go about its business raising slaves and cotton.
Yeah, and Kentucky actually ends up having kind of a shadow government. They end up having a pro-Union government and a pro-Confederacy government happening at the same time. And it was very divided, but it was largely pro-Union. The majority of soldiers who fought in the Civil War from Kentucky fought for the Union. But there were a lot of Confederates. And my own family, being from eastern Kentucky, I had a third great-grandfather who had 3 brothers in the Union Army, 2 brothers in the Confederate Army, and a brother who fought for both armies at one point in the war or another.
Being a border state, Kentucky didn't like that attitude, and they liked it even less when the Confederate Congress banned the export of cotton to the North. The tipping point was the Confederate invasion of Kentucky. They seized the small city of Columbus, Kentucky as part of a failed plan to take the port of Paducah. Suddenly, the Union's invitation to join them was very appealing, and Kentucky did so on September 18, 1861.
Yeah, because the Confederates were seen as having violated Kentucky's neutrality first. And as soon as word came that the Confederates had moved into Kentucky from western Tennessee, General Grant, who's a brigadier general at this point and controls the district there around Cairo, Illinois. Cairo, Illinois is where the Ohio River and the Mississippi River come together right here. So he immediately takes his troops into Kentucky to confront the threat, now that he's not worried about violating neutrality anymore.
There were 11 Confederate states, but the Confederate flag has 13 stars because the South so desperately wanted to manifest the addition of Kentucky and Missouri to the CSA fold. And math's hard. As you probably know, it didn't happen, although both states did have Confederate-side governments.
Right.
The capital of Kentucky's alt government was Bowling Green, which it lost to Union forces in early 1862.
These are all scenes from the Battle of Shiloh in the Grant documentary, which is very, very good, from the History Channel.
But in a radical departure from actual logic, Confederate Missouri set up its capital in Marshall, Texas. In case geography class is a distant or non-existent memory for you, Texas is nowhere near Missouri. Marshall was an important manufacturing hub for the South and eventually became the capital of the Confederate West, but still, nowhere near Missouri. So what's up with that?
That makes no sense.
Hey, that was Lucifer from the TV show Lucifer.
First, Missouri tried to be neutral like Kentucky, but the Union strategically placed units around the state, solidifying control of all-important St. Louis. Are you catching the river theme yet? The Union's smart maneuvers essentially took St. Louis and the state capital of Jefferson City out of the running for the shadow government, so why not Texas? At least the state's southern figureheads, or rather officials, were sitting pretty hundreds of miles away from fighting, although what they actually did from there isn't clear.
And Missouri being kind of on the frontier, so to speak, it's in that Trans-Mississippi theater. It did see a lot of action, but a lot of it was like irregular troops, guerrillas, things like that, bushwhackers, sometimes they were called. But there were some significant battles that took place there. Ulysses S. Grant, his wife's family's from Missouri. He lived there for a decade or so, had a farm there for a while.
The obvious answer is geography is hard too.
She was looking for geology and misread the sign. Yeah, I said, we do not study countries in here.
The Union worked hard to keep outside powers, particularly strong European countries, from officially recognizing the Confederacy as a legit government. The North worried that manufacturing nations who depended on raw Southern cotton to feed their industry, especially Britain, would back the South to keep their looms running. Fortunately, aggressive Union diplomacy, the South's repeated blunders, European unease with backing a government of slaveholders, and crises at home kept Europe mostly on the sidelines.
Yeah, it's an understatement to say that the Union had some hiccups with the British, but some good diplomacy managed to deal with a lot of that. William Seward, who was the Secretary of State and really a lot of people thought should have been elected president in 1860. A lot of Republicans thought he was the guy, the go-to guy. Didn't happen that way, and that's a story in and of itself. But Seward was a little more hardcore, a little less diplomatic than Abraham Lincoln was. And when you had things like the Trent Affair, which was when the Union stopped a Confederate ship that had British diplomats on board, it could have been ugly, but Lincoln kind of walked it back and did really well with that. But there was something called the Cotton Famine that happened in England during the American Civil War, where a lot of the British textile mills were not getting the cotton they needed, initially at least, from the South because it had been cut off. But they did eventually find other sources, places like Egypt, to get that cotton.
With one exception. The outlier was the little duchy of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a small state that existed before Germany congealed into a unified country. It wasn't a financial or industrial power, and it wasn't especially easy to find on a map.
But it was really important because the ruling house at that time it was going to become the ruling house. Because right at that point you have Queen Victoria, who's technically from the House of Hanover, but starting with her son, it would be the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha until they changed it to Windsor. And actually Queen Elizabeth would have been a part of that house, Queen Elizabeth II. Because that was where Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, was from.
Never heard of it.
It's quite small.
Told you geography is hard. Nevertheless, Consul Ernst Raven from plucky little Saxe-Coburg-Gotha arrived in Texas in 1861, bringing his country's official support along with him. But Saxe-Coburg-Gotha soon joined the Confederacy on the list of countries that no longer exist. It was rolled up under the umbrella of the German Empire in 1871 and formally dissolved with the rest of Germany's hereditary monarchies in 1918 after World War I. In case that name's been on the tip of your tongue this whole time, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha's major export was Prince Albert, the guy who married Britain's Queen Victoria. He's not the one in the can. That was his son, the future Edward VII. Judah Benjamin was one of the most colorful and controversial members of the Confederate government. Born into a Jewish family in the West Indies, he immigrated to New Orleans as a child and later built a successful career as a lawyer. He represented Louisiana in the U.S. Senate in 1852. He later joined the Confederate government as Attorney General, then Secretary of War, and finally Secretary of State.
Yeah, people forget what a prominent role a Jewish member of the Confederate cabinet played in this entire war.
When it was clear that the Confederacy was crumbling, Benjamin knew it was time to go. So sometime in early May, with the war over but the Confederate government still scuttling through the ruined South, Benjamin took off. The details of his escape are slim and heavily mythologized. One account has him pretending to be French. But since Benjamin never wrote his memoirs and burned his personal papers before his death, we'll never know what really happened. What we do know is that he was the only major member of the Confederate government to successfully escape the imploding South. He made it to Havana and then to Britain, where he revived his law career.
And there were a lot of members of the Confederate government. I guess it depends on how they define major. Members of the Confederate government, many of the higher-ranking generals who left the country, went to Mexico, went to Egypt, went to Canada, places like that. And a lot of them eventually did come back.
And after his death in 1884, he was buried in Paris's famed Père Lachaise cemetery. During the Civil
Interesting. I didn't know that's where he was buried. That's the same cemetery where Jim Morrison from The Doors is buried, and a bunch of Napoleon's marshals are buried there. I really need to get there next time I'm in France.
War, Black Americans, often freedmen who'd been liberated by the Union Army, served with distinction, under Union colors, obviously. But in early 1865, one of the "we'll try anything stupid once" ideas the dying South had was to arm enslaved men and order them to fight for the soon-to-be lost cause that wanted to keep them enslaved. Really, Confederacy? No surprise, it went badly. Arguments raged about whether the enslaved men should be freed in exchange for their service.
And we've done videos about the whole idea of black Confederates, and you know, however you want to look at it, were there technically black men who were in Confederate uniform? Yeah, but the circumstances of how that came about, don't even think of trying to compare it to what was happening in the North, where you had black men volunteering to fight for the Union by the hundreds of thousands. Many of the black Confederates were there for lots of other reasons other than that they loved the Confederacy and wanted to defend it.
The men in question were suspected of taking up for the South in order to escape across Union lines. Shocker, that one. And the Confederate establishment was so jittery about putting weapons in the hands of men they treated as possessions that very few were actually conscripted into the fight for Richmond.
You remember me?
Just a few weeks later, the Confederacy was done, and soon thereafter, slavery was abolished in the United States. The legend of the lost Confederate gold is alive and well and aggressively fueling History Channel search parties, and there is at least some truth to the story. In 1934,
and that's the case with a lot of stories that we kind of dismiss as being ridiculous. There's some kernel of truth. There's some reason why that story came about in the first place.
two Baltimore boys found a cache of gold coins, and in 2023, a Civil War-era gold hoard was found in Kentucky. The Confederacy was bad at record keeping, and geography and math, as you now know, and the chaos of war meant that assets could easily go missing. One such jackpot was the remains of the Confederate treasury, which limped south through Virginia and the Carolinas with Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government, who were on the run after the fall of Richmond. Much of this money was used to pay Confederate soldiers returning home, but $250,000, in 1865 money no less, was stolen by bandits. Much of it was never recovered, and treasure hunters hold on to the hope some of it is still hidden somewhere.
It's not sitting in some big pile somewhere. They spent it. It got distributed. It's gone. You might find little bits of it here and there, or you might find little bits of money in general, but there's not some big hoard of all of that money sitting in one place.
Georgia. Wilkes County, right around the city of Washington, ironically enough, is the place that persistently is the rumored location, but nothing's ever been found there. The idea of hot air balloons as weapons of war might sound silly, but these impractical modes of transport were used by both the Union and Confederate forces looking for a bird's eye view of the enemy. Inflated with gas or portable hydrogen generators, Civil War military balloons could carry 1 to 5 men.
This civilian is going to direct my fire from that balloon.
Yeah, so this is from The Blue and the Gray. That's McClellan on the right. The guy playing him much older than the real McClellan.
Both sides sent up manned reconnaissance balloons during the 7 Days Campaign, when the Confederates pushed back Union attempts to capture Richmond despite Union balloons having eyes on the city's downtown. But a little earlier in the war, Union General Fitzjohn Porter had an alarming experience when the observation balloon he was in broke loose from its tether and drifted over Confederate lines.
And that's kind of the inspiration for the story that you get in The Blue and the Gray.
Hotshots notwithstanding, Porter drifted back into Union-held territory and safely.
Hey, fun fact, let me show you something here.
Lines. Hotshots notwithstanding, Porter drifted back into.
So this actor right here, he's one of the main characters in The Blue and the Gray. That's Cooper Huckabee, and if you've seen the movie Gettysburg, he plays the Confederate spy Harrison in that movie. Looks completely different, but the same guy.
Union-held territory and safely descended, going on to sketch the Confederate positions he'd observed. The Union program was disbanded in 1863, although a fragmentary account exists of balloon use during the siege of Petersburg in 1864. Confederate efforts petered out after one balloon fell prey to friendly fire and another was captured.
Interesting. All right, so that was good stuff. It's a good, unique view at some of the parts of the American Civil War that maybe don't get talked about enough. As always, I'm always taking recommendations for video ideas. This came from one such recommendation, so let me know in the comment section below. Or if you are a patron or a member and you're part of our Discord server, you can recommend videos to me there and share the link as well. Thanks for watching.